Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Welcome to the ADHD Experts webinar series. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the Attitude team, I'd like to thank you for joining today's presentation titled A Parent's Guide to the Best School Options for Students with ADHD and Learning Differences. Choosing the best school option for your child is a momentous and overwhelming task. For students with ADHD and learning differences, the perfect learning environment not only addresses their needs, but also helps them thrive academically, socially, psychologically. Of course, financial considerations, logistics, and other factors complicate the decision for families. From public schools to homeschool to tutoring services, today's webinar will provide practical advice and considerations to help parents weigh all of their schooling options and help them begin to identify the ones that may best suit their child's needs. Leading today's presentation is Kuhl. Kathy speaks across the United States and internationally to help parents customize instruction for their children with ADHD, LD, autism, and/or giftedness. She holds a BA from William and Mary and has completed advanced training from the Atlantic Seaboard Dyslexia Education Center in teaching math to students with learning differences. To see her blog and to learn more, visit learndifferently.com. Before I hand over the microphone to Kathy, I have just a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned into the live webinar may download the slides now by clicking on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. And if you're interested in the certificate of attendance, look for instructions in the email that you will receive about an hour after we wrap up today's live broadcast. If you are listening in replay or podcast mode, visit attitudemag.com and search for podcast number 400 to access the slides, the webinar replay, and the certificate of attendance option. If you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine for your family or to share with a teacher or a loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. And if you subscribe now, you will not only receive our summer issue, which is arriving with subscribers now, but also our annual back to school issue in the fall. Finally, the sponsor of this webinar is Landmark College. Landmark College summer programs provide an intentional and supportive community that assists students who learn differently, including high school students, graduating high school seniors, and students enrolled at colleges around the country. Programs are designed to enable students to identify strengths and learn specific strategies to be successful. Instructors consist of current LC faculty, as well as teachers from the surrounding area who are experienced in working with students who learn differently. Visit landmark.edu/summer to learn more. Attitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without any further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Kuhl. Kathy, thank you so much for joining us today and leading us in this really important discussion about finding the right school environment for your child.
Thank you. It's great to be back. I think a lot of Attitude Magazine and the website has many helpful resources. I regularly listen to these webinars and podcasts and recommend them to colleagues and family and friends. Parents and caregivers want what's best for their children. For children with ADHD or learning disabilities, it's harder to figure out which educational options suit them best. As more parents worked from home during the pandemic, they had a closer look at how their kids were being taught and how well they were learning particularly online. Schools and staff struggled to meet the challenges, and the students with ADHD or learning disabilities particularly struggled, so some families are ready to make changes. We have an abundance of options. In the U.S., there are many choices. In other countries, there are as well. Imagine for a moment that you're at a huge buffet table, but you have a child who's a picky eater. What can you find that they will eat that's good for them? It's a similar situation with education. We've got many school options. To choose the best, you need to understand your child, your family, and the options and tips to how to search better. What do I mean about knowing your child? No one knows a child better than their primary caregivers, but knowing them as learners is different. You need to make some lists. Jot down the learning challenges your child faces. Jot down any new concerns you have since the pandemic. Some students have slid further behind even than their peers during these last couple years. Third, list your child's strengths, interests, and talents. No one builds a productive life by focusing on their weaknesses. If you don't know what your child's strengths are, write down what you do see. If you'd asked me when my son was 9, I would have said he was good at Legos and at talking to strangers. But he's grown. Next, summarize how your child learns best. What do you know about that? What have you seen? What qualities and teachers have been most helpful for your children? What settings have worked best? An interest-led, Montessori-like approach? Or does your child thrive with more structure? What kinds of helps have been most effective for your kids with ADHD and executive function deficits? Executive functions are the cognitive skills that you need to organize your work, your time, and your stuff. They require you to pay attention and to know when to shift attention. They require working memory and self-control. What does your child need in terms of structure and support? For their learning disabilities, what remediation and accommodations have been helpful? Did the lockdowns and virtual learning affect your child's emotional and mental health? Now more students suffer from anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues. So consider each school setting and how it promotes your child's emotional health. To find out more about how your child learns best, think also about that individualized education plan you may have. An IEP or a 504 plan can be a way for you to identify some strategies that you'd want to see in other settings. Don't let that IEP or 504 limit you, though. The IEP or 504 plans, those are a public school plan documenting services that the schools agreed to provide to qualifying students. But that may have been constrained by their budget or other factors. You might Google IEP Bank to find a list of things people put in IEPs to get some more ideas. Find your child's test reports, those diagnostic test results that you may have accumulated over the years. I did, for instance, psych educational batteries, neuropsych evaluations, other testing. The ends of the reports typically list recommendations. And then ask your child's teachers, therapists, what's worked for that child. Leanne Cahill of Independent School Options recommended you ask your child's current teachers what structures and routines have helped them, what drove them crazy, what helped them when they began to dysregulate, and so on. I've listed more questions on this slide number 10. But if you're not looking at the slides right now, you can look at those later. You can visit my website, learndifferently.com/options for a list of these questions and all the resources I'll be mentioning. What worked in special subjects? What helped on the bus? What helped when your child began to melt down? So take all those things that helped and make a list and prioritize them. Ms. Cahill recommends that you take the top 5 or 6 and use those as you consider different schools. So that's the first thing. We have to know our kids as learners. Second, you have to know your own family's expectations and values. Let's look at values first. How important is it to you that your child have time in music and the arts, time outdoors, athletics, character development, religious instruction? What's your educational philosophy? What are your goals for your child's education? Stop and think about it because, well, we all want our children to be able to provide for themselves and take care of themselves. But what other goals do we have? You can focus on good character, emotional intelligence, citizenship, concern for social justice, cultural heritage, cultivating a love and knowledge of the goodness, truth, and beauty. Different people value different things more in education, so think about that. I also want to consider 3 limiting factors that will help good to be thinking about as you start your search. The first is money. Financially, can you afford private school? They're generally nonprofits with limited amount of money for aid. Financial aid is need-based. You can go to school and student services and fill out a parent financial statement to find out how much you will be expected to contribute. Again, that's on the resource pages at the end of these slides. Solutionsbysss.com is that website. Once you fill out that form, the schools will use the data there as a starting point to determine aid. They might help with 10% of your tuition or much more. Ms. Cahill cautioned that the amount of aid your family is going to get will be determined by how much money the school has to give and how badly they need your child to balance the population of each grade. For instance, if they have all boys and you're a girl, you've got a better shot at tuition than the other way. The second limiting factor is time. Excuse me. The second factor with money is, can you afford to homeschool? Homeschooling is very inexpensive, much cheaper than private school. Parents do pay for curriculum and for in-person or online classes, although in California and in Alaska, the government provides some funding. Now let's move on to time. Public school takes the least amount of time, though I urge you to volunteer. As a public school parent, I found it was a great way to build relationships with teachers and faculty. Homeschooling probably takes the most amount of time, not because you teach every subject, but because parents coordinate and facilitate their children's learning, and that time can mean lost income. In many homeschool families, one parent works, but sometimes parents will take different shifts and share teaching and supervision. Single parents also homeschool and use different strategies. They adjust their work hours. Some have changed jobs and involve other adults in their children's learning. And I put more resources on how single parents homeschool in the resource section at the end of these slides. The third limiting factor is location and transportation. Is the commute to the school you're looking at feasible? This applies if you're looking at a private school, homeschool group classes, and sometimes tutoring. Extracurriculars and social life are also part of your child's education, and they require transportation. Unless your child is in the local public school, their school projects and social life will require more driving and bus time. When my daughter went to a magnet school, her friends were scattered across 6 counties. The extra driving time affects your family, your other children, your wallet, and you. So those are the first 2 factors to consider, knowing your child as a learner and knowing what your family wants and needs. But the focus of this talk is on different educational options and the tools to help help parents search and decide. Public school options, private school options, there's several of each of those. We'll look at private tutors and at a variety of homeschool options as well. Public school options vary, but they have several things in common. In the U.S., public means government-run schools. They're called state schools in Great Britain. Federal, state, and local governments set the goals, the standards, the curriculum, and pay for the schools. Now, I should say that I do work with families internationally, and I'm happy to provide resources and consultations to families working abroad. I often do. Advantages of public or state-funded schooling is it's free. That's good. Free is good. And some students will qualify for free additional help, remediation, and accommodation. Those helps are enumerated in a Section 504 plan or an IEP. Remember, that's Individualized Education Plan. Those plans are portable if you move to another public school within the U.S. And if the school agrees that your student needs speech therapy, physical therapy, or occupational therapy, then they provide it at the school for free. They may not provide those services if your child is not enrolled in public school. If they're in private school or homeschooled, the policy will vary depending on your school district. The public schools may not provide as much therapy as you think is adequate, even if your child is in public school. There can be some cons. The public school may consider that your student's progress is adequate. If you have a child who is gifted, the giftedness can hide a learning disability. A learning disability can hide giftedness. The school's limited resources may go to students whose needs seem more severe. Some public schools under-identify kids with special needs because they don't have the resources. Let's look at some specific kinds of public schools. The most common, of course, is your local public school, the one down the street, a mile away. Because it's close to home, it's convenient. There's free transportation. The local school district and the state, with input from the federal government, determine goals and choose curriculum. Teachers have limited ability to adapt instruction to change curriculum for your students' needs. Many pressures make it hard for public school teachers to give students the individualized attention that some students need to thrive. I've taught public school. I know that classroom teaching is hard, online teaching is harder, and doing both at once is probably the worst. But there's more that teachers face in public school. I have a lot of respect for public school teachers. As Henry Perkinson wrote in the book An Imperfect Panacea, American Faith in Education, with every passing decade, government has asked schools to do more and more. Society expects schools to solve societal problems and to shape citizens of the future. This is a big trend in the U.S., not as much in other places, perhaps. Addressing those mandates and then also preparing your kids for standardized tests can crowd out time for literature, music, art, and the more individualized instruction that our kids need. A second public option is magnet schools and other special kinds of schools. So a few districts even have twice exceptional schools. Twice exceptional means being diagnosed as gifted while also having ADHD, autism, dyslexia, or another learning disability. Twice exceptional is often abbreviated 2E. Check with your school counselor or your local school district to see what's available. You may need to pry a little bit. If you're looking into magnet programs, attend the public school meetings about them, visit the open houses, and ask about what supports are offered. You might say, my child's an avid learner but has some struggles with organization. What help is available? Another public option is charter schools. They are tuition free, open to all, but the staff has more autonomy than that of other public schools. They choose their own curriculum and standards and discipline policy. So charter schools differ from public schools and among themselves. Like other public schools, they depend on test scores to show their value. Currently, there are about 7,700 charter schools in the U.S. and over 3 million students enrolled in them. They have very early application deadlines. U.S. News says it's November. Contrasts that with private schools that usually have later times, but check with your local charter schools if you're interested far in advance. Charter schools have a limited number of seats. If they get more applicants than they have seats, they hold a lottery. They don't follow the traditional school borders or boundaries. They're limited by state borders or by city limits. Any school's funding determines how many resources, how much help it can provide. Charter schools are no exception. According to Susan Yellen, charter schools may have fewer services because they're less likely to have full-time therapists such as speech and language pathologists. Some charters are run by for-profit companies and chains, and a few charter schools focus on dyslexia or autism. I hope to get a list of those particular schools and add it to my resource page. Publiccharters.com is trying to obtain that information for me. Publiccharters.org, that's the National Alliance on Public Charter Schools. And I'll be adding that to the resource page at learndifferently.com/options. As I mentioned, charter schools are required to comply with IEPs and 504s. If you apply for your child to enroll in a charter school, the school cannot ask on the application if your child has special needs unless they're one of the schools chartered specifically to serve a particular disability. To learn more about getting IEP and 504 services fulfilled at a charter school, see the Department of Education's fact sheet, which is called Know Your Rights. The link is in the last slides at the end of this talk and also on my website. Ask the charter schools' special education consultants how they honor 504s and IEPs. Ask them how many hours of training are given to teachers on teaching kids with ADHD and LD, and what kind of training. How are disciplinary actions tailored to kids with ADHD and learning disabilities? What accommodations do they provide for dysgraphia, dyslexia, autism? One kind of charter school is online charter schools. In at least 35 states, you can get free online school programs. In some states, these services are also provided for free to homeschooled and private schooled students. Again, like other charters and other public schools, these online charter schools are required to honor the IEP and 504. Some of them will have special ed consultants to consult with you. There are also private online schools that I'll be talking about later. So those are the various kinds of public schools: your local school, magnet, TUI, and other special program schools, charter schools, and online charters. Moving on now to look at private school options. Again, there are many. Private schools means schools that are independent, not funded by the government. Along with general private schools, there are religious schools for many different faiths, private schools specifically for special needs, alternative schools, boarding schools. Some micro schools and learning pods are considered private schools, as I'll explain. I will use the words private and independent interchangeably. Private schools are privately funded with limited scholarships. They are funded by endowments, donations, and you. They are not funded by the government except in a couple of rare cases. In some states, if you have an educational savings account or tax credit, you can apply that to private schools. There's more about this at edchoice.org. Again, the link is at the end of the slides. Or if your state agrees with you that your child needs a private school to get a free, appropriate public education, then the state will pay for it. In March, Disability Scoop reported that there's a new category of student to consider. Let me check my slides here, I think. Yeah, here we go. For students who were never in public school, that is, students whose parents sent them straight to private school, if they would have qualified for services, the Department of Education says that the local school district must take some of the federal funds and use that to provide services for the student enrolled in private school. Now, there's a 55-page document explaining this new guidance, and the link is here on this slide 23, and in the handouts. The resources at the end of the slides. What about IEPs and 504s? Well, they don't generally apply in a private school unless the state has determined that a child needs to go to this school in order to get a free, appropriate public education. And getting the state to agree to a private school is a long legal process. States vary. If you're pursuing this path, get an advocate to help you. Where I live in Northern Virginia, outside Washington, D.C., my county has 2 private schools that the state may send students to if they think that's appropriate for a free, appropriate public education. There are, as I mentioned before, online private schools. They are available at every state. The oldest are Calvert and Keystone, but Laurel Springs and many others have been around. I could not possibly list them all. I mentioned a few here as not recommending these in particular, except that they're better known. SchoolChoiceWeek.com has a list of these. Again, that's in the resource slides at the end. If you're considering an online private school or an online charter school for your child, ask yourself these questions. How was their learning online during the pandemic? Some kids loved it. No distraction, no frustration trying to understand those nonverbal social cues. They could just focus on their work. But if it didn't go well for your child, ask yourself, how will this be different? Is your child self-motivated? Will they ask the teacher for help, even if it's a teacher they've never met? That can be an issue for some students. And then ask the online school what remediation and accommodations they can provide, how they teach out-of-the-box learners, how do they teach executive functioning skills, How will they tolerate movement, fidget toys, that sort of thing? Can they let the child turn the camera off? How will they determine if that was a bad idea? And you should also ask them all of the other questions I'll get to starting at slide 32 through 34, the general questions for any private school. Some private schools are designated specifically for kids with special needs. There are many of them. Our sponsor is affiliated with one of them, but I mentioned Landmark School before I knew Landmark College was the sponsor today. It was not influenced me. So there's a few here you can look at and many more. Private boarding school is another option. But if it's not cheap and it's not close, why should we even consider this? I put that question to John Wilson, who's executive director of SOAR. SOAR provides an academy for students with ADHD and learning disabilities for grades 7 through 12, and they offer summer camps, high adventure, and gap year programs. Mr. Wilson said that boarding schools provide structure, community, and an opportunity for your child to learn and grow in ways that are not possible in home-based learning. He said, not every child needs a boarding school environment, but there are situations where it can be very beneficial. They have a total of 36 students in their school, for instance, in grades 7 through 12. Education consultant Leanne Cahill advised that we parents shouldn't write off boarding schools right away. This faculty and staff are a strong team. They're close by, 5-minute walk from where your child's room is. She pointed out that family dynamics can sometimes be triggering our children's difficult behaviors. And she had this phrase. She said, you're not sending them away. You're giving them an opportunity to go. So Ms. Cahill advises that unless your child is a danger to him or herself, you should consider boarding schools, at least research them and keep an open mind. Sometimes learning pods are considered private schools. Learning pods or micro schools are small groups of parents who band together to share the costs and supervision of their children's education. They sprang up during the pandemic, but they're still continuing. There's been legislation in West Virginia recently passed to declare them an adequate way to provide a compulsory education and requirements for them. Whether or not they're considered a private school depends on who chooses the curriculum and who directs the schooling. School Choice Week has an article about this and a link so that you can find out the law in your particular state. In general, if a parent chooses the curriculum and guides the children's learning, it's a homeschool. If they have a teacher teaching unique classes, it's a private school. And if your kids are just doing online public school learning and then the adult is merely supervising, you're not homeschooling or private schooling. It's considered a public school student. As I said, the rules vary by state. So visit schoolchoiceweek.com and the Learning Pods section will help you find the law for your state. Let's move on to the search process. How do you find the right private school? Well, Carol Barnier is an expert on dyslexics with ADHD, and her first question is to find out if the reading specialist, uses an Orton-Gillingham-based approach. Orton-Gillingham approaches to teaching dyslexics are considered the most effective and are what's recommended by the International Dyslexia Association. There are many ways to teach reading. Turns out reading really is rocket science, so it helps to get someone who has adequate training. John Wilson of SOAR Academy said, before you visit, write a list of questions and an answer key so to have handy the answers you're looking for. And he recommends having your child help create that list and answer those questions. Education consultant Leanne Cahill says to ask about the professional development and teacher training that all the teachers are getting, not just the learning specialist. Ask about the type of work, not just how much work there is, but what kinds of learning. Are the students learning how to learn? She said, sometimes schools can be a bit too rigid and product-oriented rather than process-oriented, more like an AP class than an honors or seminar class. If you're considering private schools, I would at least talk to and consider hiring an education consultant. The Independent Educational Consultants Association can help you find an experienced, vetted consultant. Next, I want to turn to tutoring as an option for your child's education. If you want to hire a tutor to be your child's primary educator, instead of sending them off to school, make sure that satisfies the compulsory education laws in your state. For example, here in Virginia, it is legal provided the tutor has a current teaching license. How do you know if your child's going to benefit from a tutor? Well, how have they done in other one-on-one low student-teacher ratio situations? And can you provide ways for them to be with other children? Check with the local homeschool community, the rec department, and clubs. There's one particular kind of tutor I want to discuss for just a moment. To get a dyslexia specialist is different from getting a reading specialist. This is one kind of tutoring that's not full-time, but can be vital for our students with dyslexia. There are several kinds of specialists trained in teaching dyslexia, Wilson, Barton, Erini, and others. I won't go through all this, but these resources available here at the end of the slides can help you find someone. Most of these specialists have completed 100 hours of practice tutoring before they were certified. To return to tutoring in general, how do you find a good tutor? Here we go. First, consider how many hours a week you want to hire this tutor. It's hard to find a tutor that's going to commit to 30 or more hours a week, and it's quite expensive. I have worked with 2 families who have done this. Some of the time you may want to monitor the child's independent work or have a relative or a babysitter do that. You or those others can drive your child to speech therapy or dyslexia training. You don't need to hire a tutor to do that driving. You may want to use a tutoring service. There's some overhead fees that will make it a little more expensive. The going rate here in the Washington, D.C. suburbs for a tutor is currently $60 to $100 an hour. I'll discuss cheaper options in a moment. But the tutoring agency will run a background check the tutor's credentials and references, and file the tax paperwork. But if you hire the tutor directly yourself, they're either your employee or your independent contractor, and there may be tax consequences. You may need to file with the IRS. You should check with an accountant. I am not an accountant. To find a tutor to help your child with ADHD or learning challenges, where do you look? Well, first ask your school and ask your favorite teachers. Then check with your local chapter of CHAD, the American ADDA, or the Learning Disabilities Association for recommendations. And then ask those potential tutors or owners of the tutoring agency about this tutor's experience with kids with learning disabilities and attention deficit disorder. When you try a tutor, observe silently from across the room. Don't sit down at the table with them. Maybe listen from the next room. I've been a tutor. Let the tutor get to know the student and how he or she learns. And trust your gut and your student's gut. If you're working with an independent tutor, not from an agency, I must stress, please get a background check. And remember that just because this tutor has a high IQ, a PhD, or a teaching certificate, doesn't mean they know how to teach a child with attention deficit disorder or learning disabilities. But what if these options are too expensive? You got lots of other possibilities. Having a tutor work with your child online may be cheaper than having come to your home. Tutors I know spend a lot of time driving from house to house. There's many online tutoring programs. Everyone's heard of Khan Academy. There are many excellent tutors providing lessons on YouTube, but any use of YouTube should be very carefully monitored because they put ads up for all kinds of things that might not be appropriate for your student. There are other programs online, Varsity Tutors. Upchieve has volunteer tutors working with them, and it's free. I've included an article in the last slides about where to find cheap tutoring. Asking your family, do you have neighbors, family members who could tutor? There may be local high school or college students. And one thing that's particularly helpful is checking with the special education department at your local university, because those students may be required to do a number of volunteer hours before they can complete their training. So there's lots of ways to find tutors. Turning next to homeschooling. I gave a talk recently for CHAD of Northern Virginia, and I titled it Homeschooling Not What You May Think. It doesn't mean staying at home, and homeschooling is not what public school parents did during the pandemic. One woman I spoke to said she thought that homeschoolers were antisocial weirdos who stayed home all day. But then she started homeschooling and found that they were able to see more of the world. In fact, that's a common expression among homeschoolers, that the world is their classroom. They can get into the community and learn from people of all ages. What homeschooling is parent-directed education. The parents set the goals, choose the curriculum, set the daily and weekly schedule. They may include outside classes. I call it outsourcing. And they can customize the learning environment in ways that may surprise you. Homeschooling offers tremendous flexibility. Imagine a world where everyone only ate carry-out food. And then if you suggested they try home cooking, it would sound really hard to them. They'd have to learn about nutrition and planning menus and writing grocery lists. They'd have to shop and learn to cook and get it all on the table at the same time. It probably would sound crazy to those people, but the results could be healthy and satisfying and suit the kids very well. Homeschooling's a bit like that. Tremendous options. Students can learn at their own pace. That means less boredom, especially for our gifted students. Parents can flex the daily and yearly schedule. If a child is in tears 20 minutes into every math lesson, then parents could have a 15-minute math lesson and then have a break to go jump rope. They can incorporate movement in the homeschool, modify seating. Kids sit on an exercise ball, work under the table, work on a whiteboard. A lot of more hands-on learning, immersive learning, field trips, tactile things, tactile activities. Homeschool parents value being able to schedule therapies and tutoring midday before the student is exhausted. Homeschooling parents can control the environment and limit the distractions, practice math facts while jumping on a trampoline, reading outdoors, and much more. Examples of building homeschool around the child's interests. A few families I have worked with. One family built their homeschool around their child's love of learning, incorporating historical fiction, field trips, work as an apprentice reenactor at a historic site. After a family crisis, another homeschool family had a traumatized high school student, but she still loved Japanese animation, and that anime was about all she wanted to work on. So a parent built a curriculum around that, including Japanese language and history. Later, the student graduated from a renowned art institute. In high school, students can study not only the usual offerings, but equine science, marine science, astronomy. They've studied entrepreneurship and launched businesses. They've studied fashion design and written bestsellers. I interviewed 65 parents who homeschooled kids with ADHD or learning disabilities and asked them why they homeschooled. The chief reason was academic. Others were having trouble getting help from school. Family life was suffering. Several parents said that it reduced their family stress to homeschool. Bullying and other social problems were another reason people chose homeschooling. Some parents reported that they could better monitor medication, sometimes reduce medication, although this should never be done without a doctor's supervision. Homeschooling is legal in all 50 states, in Canada, and in many other countries. The Homeschool Legal Defense Association lists those laws. That's hslda.org. The listings include attendance requirements. The state laws include attendance requirements, testing, who may homeschool whom, for example. In some states, grandparents, not just parents, can homeschool students. So HSLDA is a good resource on those laws. They also have a large special needs section with consultants available by phone for members. Homeschool parents are not bound to follow an IEP. Some parents do. Some create their own student education plan, and that can be helpful. I have been asked by some parents, what about transcripts? If they homeschool, what will they do for transcripts? It's surprisingly easy. Colleges want students who have completed a good course of study. Homeschool parents typically include brief course descriptions and recommendations from teachers who aren't relatives, which is easy to get because there are so many homeschool co-ops and group classes. It is not harder for homeschooled students to get into good colleges. In fact, Harvard and Stanford were among the first colleges to post admissions information for homeschoolers on their websites. Some states have umbrella schools that can manage transcripts. The North Atlantic Regional High School, NARS, can also provide that service for families all over the country. In those cases, on paper, your student looks like a private school student. There are lots of resources to help you produce those transcripts. There are many ways to homeschool. You can buy a complete packaged curriculum. There are hundreds of those. I won't mention any right now. More commonly, for kids with learning disabilities or attention deficit disorder, parents select different curriculum for different subjects. There are homeschool conventions and many downloadable samples so that you can examine different curriculum. My favorite way to recommend parents look for homeschool curriculum is CathyDuffyReviews.com. That's CathyDuffy reviews.com. She has reviewed thousands of homeschool curriculum. She will discuss them in detail, and making it to her top 100 list is an honor. Curriculum Publishers prize very highly. She's a great resource for searching. It's very common for homeschool parents to not teach all the subjects themselves. Homeschool parents can get involved, can outsource classes through homeschool co-ops, where every parent chips in one way or another. Those co-ops can be just a few kids up to over 100. Homeschool classes are also offered through groups that use the university model, or a la carte classes that meet once or twice a week. Some students, especially juniors and seniors in high school, homeschooled high school, will start taking classes at community colleges, dual enrollment. There are a few specialized homeschool groups that provide help for kids with learning disabilities, like Firm Foundations Academy in Pennsylvania, or Eden Hope Academy, which has locations and welcomes kids with various special needs. So, in conclusion, as parents, you have a lot of options. You need to first know your child as a learner. Second, you need to know your family's needs and expectations, and then you can start exploring. Public school options include local charter schools, magnets, online charters. Private school options can be general private schools, specialized ones, boarding schools, including and online private schools and learning pods. You could hire a tutor just to work with your child, or you could homeschool, on the many ways to do that. I want to thank you for listening today. I've focused on U.S. schools in today's talk, but I do help families internationally, and I can't speak to the laws and situations of every country. I have a little experience with international schools, and I am happy to talk with you individually. People can reach me at learndifferently.com to schedule a time to talk. The resources that I've mentioned are at learndifferently.com/options, as well as the last slides of this presentation. I have added a few things to my website since I submitted the slides for this talk. And I want to thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions.
Wonderful. Kathy, thank you so much. That was truly a very comprehensive overview, and so many recommended resources for our listeners to take with them. Before we start our Q&A, I just want to quickly, again, thank Landmark College for being our sponsor for this webinar. And I would say there is a lot of interest in the groups listening about the hybrid homeschool option. A number of people asking if you can talk a little bit more about if there's a repository, a list of hybrid homeschoolers, how to kind of tap into that community, and also how to find teachers who may contribute to a hybrid homeschool model.
Okay. I would think those teachers would be tutors, so I would start there for that part of the problem. By hybrid homeschooling, I mean that very few, I don't think I've worked with any homeschool parents that do all of the teaching themselves. Generally, parents outsource some of the work. As older students, parents will continue to teach the subjects they're most comfortable with. And, I did not teach Spanish to anybody. So if I were homeschooling a child who wanted to learn Spanish, I would hire someone. The Homeschool Legal Defense Association website, hslda.org, has lists of homeschool groups by state homeschool organizations, and those will have websites that list local groups in your area. So that's a good place to look. You can also just Google, if you live in Montana, Google Homeschool Montana groups and get some there. I'm happy to consult with families individually. And Z's has a website called Homeschool A to Z, I believe. If that's not correct, just shoot me an email, folks, and I'll send you the correct one. So those would be ways to find homeschool groups where your child could take one or more classes. Some public schools will allow you to take a few classes with a public school. That really varies by district. And some homeschoolers will recommend you not do that because the public school systems occasionally start asking more and more and limiting more and more the homeschool options. So that can be problematic. The other thing would be one of the online programs that I mentioned earlier. Some of them will allow you to have your child take one or two classes online. The hybrid approach may also include the kind of university model I was speaking of, where a child goes to classes twice a week and the rest of the time they are doing their work at home with limited help from the parents. Again, that varies by state and location, so I probably better answer those questions individually.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, the hybrid question is such a broad one. But that was very helpful. Similarly, listeners interested to know if there is anywhere a comprehensive list and or ranking of boarding schools that would be particularly well suited to different learners.
I don't know, but I'll tell you what I would do. I would go to Attitude Magazine and I'd see who's advertising in there, because the schools that I do have a good opinion of, SOAR and Landmark and Eagle Hill, advertise there. I would also check with your local Learning Disabilities Association, with ADDA and CHAD, and find out what people in your part of the country, where people in your part of the country are sending their kids for boarding school.
Okay. And
sorry, Attitude Magazine, I think, has an article posted about boarding schools.
We can definitely add that to the resources. And I will mention that our fall issue is typically our Success at School issue. And you are right. We do carry a lot of advertising from schools, private schools, and those that are particularly well suited for students with ADHD and learning differences. And we have a list online of those advertisers that we can add to the resources section in the follow-up email as well. So good idea. We did have one comment that I wanted to read from a listener who noted that educational therapists work with a lot of students with LD and ADHD, different than a tutor. They recommended, I'll just spell it out. It's www.aetonline.org. And so I assume that's like the Association of Educational Therapists, but I'm guessing on that. And this listener noted that they do a lot of training and continuing education. So I just wanted to mention that. I'm not sure if you have any experience with educational therapists per se.
Yes. The academic therapist who worked with my son and helped him with his dyslexia was a kind of educational therapist. I am not familiar with aetonline.org. Well, I've heard of it, but I don't know enough to recommend it or not. But I want to thank the listener for mentioning that resource. There's several organizations that provide different kinds of educational therapies. Neurodevelopmental approaches have helped some kids, including some of the families I've interviewed, for that research on homeschooling. So there's lots of different programs that are out there, and I'd be happy to discuss individual ones with families if they care to talk with me, and I sometimes do research for families to help them investigate and decide.
Okay, perfect. And this is another broad one, but a common. Parents a little overwhelmed, wondering where they could go to just get a comprehensive list, all of the charter, magnet, private schools in their area. Now, I'm personally familiar with greatschools.org, but I have no idea there might be a more comprehensive repository out there.
Yes, I put it in the slides. It's on the first slide, slide 53. There's a link. Find the schools near you. The first link, schoolchoiceweek.org, includes public, private, charter, and private.
Wonderful. See, I didn't scroll down that far yet. Thank you. Very helpful. Okay.
And can I just add to that, parent? Yes, it is overwhelming, and I'm sorry. Take your time. And there are resources out there to help you. You don't have to figure it all out in one day. Start small and think about how far you're willing to travel and start looking. It can take a while. It's worse than shopping for a car. So just be patient with yourself. I think if you use the questions that I've provided in this presentation, that can help you narrow things down.
Wonderful. And quite a few listeners also who have twice exceptional children here today. You did mention in your section about homeschooling that tends to be particularly well suited for those 2E learners. Would you have any other advice or insights for those parents who find that their kids, are both bored and need supports in certain areas?
Yes, I will double check that I put in the slides some resources that will help any gifted child. Let me see. I think I put it on the homeschool page. Yes, at the bottom of slide 56, under homeschool options, where I have a couple of links for gifted and twice exceptional. Raising Lifelong Learners is a helpful site for anyone with a gifted child. And Hoagie's Gifted is another site. Hoagie is the nickname of a parent who has gathered a ton of information about gifted education. HOAGIE, Gifted. I think it's .org. If I've got that wrong again, shoot me a message on my website and I will correct that. And I've written for the 2E magazine. I think that link is on my handout. The Twice Exceptional magazine has some helpful resources. There are gifted specialists working in my area, Washington, D.C. area. I know a couple. With Understanding Comes Calm is Julie Skolnick's site, and she works with families. But there are probably some in many other major metropolitan areas.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, lots of resources here for people to spend evenings for weeks. Now, a couple of parents are returning to your very first point, and that is getting to know your child as a learner. And they're concerned that, first of all, they had a lot of insight, though somewhat unfortunate and often not chosen when the pandemic shut down schools, into how their child's learning. They said that otherwise they had a very skewed view, because it was through the teacher's eyes, really.
Yes.
And I guess just some, maybe some ideas for parents who want to make sure that they are getting a true view on their child as a learner, and that child is currently not at home learning.
Right. I'm glad they asked that. That's one of the reasons I liked volunteering when I had kids in school. You not only get a chance to build the relationships with the faculty and staff before you're asking them anything. If you're just sitting in the back of a classroom folding and stapling things for the teacher, you can listen and you can learn a lot that way. That's helpful. I would watch your child's mood if they begin to get seem depressed or reluctant, more resistant to homework. I don't know any child who loves homework, but a change in attitude may indicate a problem there. Let's see. Nothing else is coming to mind right now for monitoring the situation, but I will give that some thought. Maybe that should be another blog.
Yes, I know. There were a lot of epiphanies during those early days of the pandemic when we were all home and seeing. But of course, that was skewed by the experience of trying to learn virtually, which was, as you said, some kids loved it, many did not. So that tainted the whole experience. Yes. Now, I'm not familiar with these services, but a few people are asking about executive function coaching services. Two that were mentioned were ladder and parallel learning as a supplement. Wondering if you have any experience with these kinds of services.
I'm afraid that I don't. There are executive function coaches. I would think there would be a fair bit of overlap in their qualifications as with any ADHD coach. So I would look for the accrediting organizations for those, experienced ADHD tutors, and ask a lot of questions about what they're doing and how they're doing it. One family I know switched coaches partway through and found more help from the second coach. And there are also apps that are more or sometimes less effective in helping break down skills.
Right. Yes. These are new to us, so we will look into them as well. And I thought this was a great question. I think particularly if you're looking at a transition into a public school environment, whether that's a charter magnet or standard public, do you recommend getting a new neuropsychological evaluation prior to that transition?
It depends on how old the current one is. Neuropsych evals are generally considered valid for 3 years. So if it's more than 3 years old, maybe that's a good idea. It depends on how much money you have, because they aren't cheap, how acute the child's needs are, and what testing the school is willing to provide and how soon they'll provide it. Generally, they want to get to know the child before they will run even a psych ed battery, and I have not heard of any public schools paying for a neuropsych evaluation. You can, so that's not too likely. However, if you have a child who's going into 9th grade, I would wait a year on the neuropsych eval so that you don't need to pay for a new one when they're going into college. We did that with my son. We went from 6th grade to 10th grade so that his 10th grade neuropsych eval would still be considered valid when he started college.
Okay, that's useful to keep in mind. And I will squeeze in one last question that came up a fair amount, and that is, are you aware of any research regarding gender mix? So a number of listeners considering an all boys or an all girls solution for their child, a school solution, and wondering if that gender mix plays into learning.
Yes, well, I think it certainly does. I don't have research to share today on that, but anecdotally, I have certainly seen that and read reports of students thriving in boy-only, girl-only classrooms because fewer distraction, girls more likely to speak up, perhaps girls in some cases less likely to be ignored if it's an all-girl classroom. There's advantages different ways. I have several friends with 2 families in my area who have kids in a private high school, and they have all loved having classes that are small and divided in that way. That's been helpful to them, although their school does get together some activities. They do co-ed. So I think that can be helpful.
Great. I think it's a great question, and one that we will add to our editorial calendar as well to see what research may be out there. So unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. But I want to thank you, Kathy, for this amazing presentation. So comprehensive and useful. And I want to thank everyone out there listening today and contributing. A number of you sent in some recommendations for additional resources. So we will go through that and add those as well for everyone to see. Please be on the lookout for an email from us later on today with those resources, as well as the link to replay this webinar. If you are not already a magazine subscriber, we encourage you to subscribe to Attitude. You will get the summer issue, as I mentioned, as well as our fall back to school issue in a few months. And you can sign up at attitudemag.com/subscribe. If you are listening in replay or podcast mode, visit attitudemag.com and search for podcast number 400 to access the slides, the webinar replay, and the certificate of attendance option. If you support the work we're doing here at Attitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit attitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for Attitude Magazine for your family or to share with a teacher or a loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Thank you again, Kathy, for joining us today. And thank you to all of our listeners. We hope to see you all again soon.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.